Welcome to Module 4, Processes and Procedures. In this section, our focus will remain on discussing the subsequent 5 steps that aim to enhance the prevention and management of conflicts of interest. Once policies and legislation are in place, processes and procedures are needed for effective implementation. These should include definitions of conflicts of interest and the primary interest or obligation, and provide clear explanations for the specific committee process. They also need to outline practical approaches for safeguarding a committee's independence and impartiality, disclosing interests, identifying, preventing, and managing situations of concern, and monitoring and addressing breaches. Let's continue with Step 6. Ensure definitions of conflict of interest and primary interests or obligations are included, and clearly explained in processes and procedures. The relevant definition of conflict of interest should be included in institutional and committee policies and procedures. Definitions should include an explicit explanation of what constitutes a conflict of interest within the committee's specific decision-making context to promote a common understanding. Additionally, policies and procedures should clearly identify situations and activities that can potentially interfere with the institution or committee's primary goal or objective, and provide specific examples of interests that may be problematic. A quick reminder, a conflict of interest is a situation and a risk that arises when a person has a financial or other interest that could potentially interfere with their entrusted obligation, duty, or responsibility to serve a party or perform a role. For example, the primary interest of a procurement committee could be described as achieving economy, efficiency, transparency, fairness and equal treatment of tenders or proposals, and the secondary interests of procurement committee members that could interfere with primary interest might be owning stock in a pharmaceutical company, having a personal relationship with an employee of the pharmaceutical company. Next, Step 7 involves safeguarding committee independence. Public pharmaceutical committee decision-making should be independent and impartial, and members should be selected based on documented criteria. Such criteria may relate to technical expertise, knowledge or skills, or representation of a particular group or constituency. The committee should have clearly defined terms of reference that sets out the purpose and primary interest of the committee, its authority, membership, and roles and responsibilities. Let's look at some examples of actions to safeguard a committee's independence. First, do not allow the appointment of pharmaceutical industry representatives as members of committees. Particularly those committees that make decisions on the registration, selection, pricing, and procurement of pharmaceutical products and licensing of pharmaceutical manufacturers. If needed, industry viewpoints can be solicited through other mechanisms such as stakeholder consultations. Next, prohibit industry observers during certain situations where they might gain commercial advantage, for example, setting prices and making decisions on reimbursement. Another example is to require that proposed members complete a detailed written declaration of relevant interests prior to their appointment, periodically, usually annually, thereafter, and in some cases, prior to or at every meeting. Ensure that the chair and co-chairs are independent and free of conflicts of interest. And a last example is to exclude individuals with a serious conflict of interest, for instance, those with a direct financial interest in the outcomes of the decision-making. Let's continue with Step 8. Strengthen procedures for disclosure, verification, and evaluation. Effective prevention and management of conflicts of interest relies on processes that require individuals to submit declarations of interests and procedures to identify whether any conflicts exist, and the seriousness of the risks they pose. The outcomes of these procedures in turn inform the development of plans for eliminating or managing the identified conflicts of interest. In the next slides we will look at who should disclose interests, how to disclose and how often, what should be disclosed, and processes for verification and review of disclosed interests. This slide shows who should disclose interests. All individuals involved in decision-making, or the development of recommendations should disclose interests. Depending on the committee or activity, these individuals may include committee members, public sector employees, expert advisors, peer reviewers, consultants, members of the Secretariat, members of the public, representatives of civil society organizations, and patient groups. Here we will look more closely at how to disclose. Individuals should be required to submit declarations using a standard form. The form should provide a structured list of possible interests with checkboxes and space to enter details regarding each interest. The declaration should state the name of the entity that the individual has a relationship or interest with, the value of any payment or interest, and reasons for any payment or nature of interest. The form should include the timeframe for reporting each type of interest, for example, current or within the last 5 years. There should also be an open-ended option to disclose any interests not covered by the form. Detailed, written declarations should be submitted at the start of appointment, and then regularly, usually annually, for activities that occur continuously, such as procurement, or when there is a significant change in the person's work responsibilities, activities or interests. For activities that occur periodically, such as registration advisory group meetings, written disclosures should be obtained prior to every meeting or event. Many committees include the disclosure of new or agenda-specific interests as a standing item on the agenda of each meeting. Declaration forms should be stored securely in line with data protection and privacy laws. Forms should be stored for a predetermined amount of time. What should be disclosed? On this slide we see some examples of interests that may constitute a conflict of interest in public pharmaceutical decision-making, including any money received, related to employment, consulting, speaking fees, panel membership, research grants or contracts from for-profit companies and not-for-profit organizations. Payments in the form of honoraria, travel, hospitality, equity, research grants or any other payment. Gifts, monetary and non-monetary. Loans. Sponsorships. Patents, licenses, royalties, and shares. Directorship, board memberships, appointments, and leadership positions, paid or unpaid. Roles in organizations with links to industry groups that stand to benefit from decisions or recommendations. And family or personal relationships with those who may have any of the above interests. Once declarations of interest have been made, it is necessary to verify and evaluate the information received. A designated reviewer or reviewers is needed to do this. The designated reviewer should be independent, and have terms of reference for the task. Designated reviewers may need training to effectively conduct reviews. The reviewer could be a compliance officer, an official from the legal office within the ministry or government, or an official from the government's ethics office or anti-corruption commission. In some cases, the institution may establish a small group or a multidisciplinary committee that includes independent experts from different disciplines. The reviewer should first verify that the information provided on the declaration of interest form is accurate, by conducting internet searches or comparing the disclosure form with information on previously declared interests on file. Then, the reviewer needs to identify whether a disclosed interest constitutes a conflict of interest, and determine the significance or risk of any identified conflicts. To determine whether a conflict of interest exists, the reviewer should look at the individual's role in the decision-making process, the kinds of decisions and activities that the individual can potentially influence, and the extent to which they can influence them. Next, the reviewer should examine the declaration to identify any interests that create a risk that the individual will not fulfill their primary duties or obligations. To determine the seriousness of an identified conflict of interest, reviewer will need to assess 1. The probability and extent to which the conflict of interest could unduly influence decision-making, and 2. The degree of harm that could result. Let's now learn from the country example. Here is an example of Bhutan's 2019 procurement rules and regulations. They specify that the procuring agency must ensure that members appointed to the tender committee do not have a conflict of interest with any of the participating bidders. Each member of the committee is required to make a written declaration at each meeting, to acknowledge and sign that they understand the nature of the proceedings, are in no way linked, associated or involved with any of the bidders whose bids are under consideration, will maintain strict confidentiality of information related to evaluation of bids, adhere to the conditions of the Integrity Pact, are aware of the responsibilities of the committee and the ethics of procurement, and will declare any conflicts of interest. Let's continue with Step 9, identifying and implementing actions for preventing and managing conflicts of interest. In Step 8, we looked at procedures for disclosure, verification, and evaluation. If a disclosed interest is determined to be a conflict of interest, then a combination of strategies will be needed to prevent and manage the conflict of interest. The choice of strategy will depend on the risk posed by the conflict of interest and the context in which it occurs. In the next slides we will discuss how to prevent conflict of interest situations from arising. Second, manage the conflict of interest. And third, mitigate the conflict of interest. Let's look at options to prevent conflict of interest situations from arising in the first place. These options include: make the absence of conflicts of interest a criterion for selecting committee members. Ban public employees from accepting gifts, having certain financial interests, or engaging in remunerated outside employment. Do not allow pharmaceutical industry representatives to serve as committee members. Prohibit industry observers in situations where they may gain an unfair commercial advantage. Do not accept direct funding from pharmaceutical companies to support committee processes. Or require an individual to divest their financial interests with the private entity, or place investments in a blind trust. Options to manage the conflict of interest include: requiring the individual to resign from the industry board, end employment, or sever other relationships with the private entity. Recuse the individual from all discussions, decisions, and activities regarding the pharmaceutical products made by, or in competition with the respective company. Request public employees to terminate their involvement in the committee or be reassigned to different work duties. Or sever the institution's financial ties to the individual or organization that creates the conflict of interest. Possible options to mitigate the conflicts of interest include: publicly disclose the conflict of interest to promote transparency. Require the individual or institution to reduce their financial interests below a certain threshold. Limit the individual's involvement by recusing them from voting, decision-making, or discussions. Limit the individual's access to information that may be used to benefit their secondary interests. Appoint an independent individual or oversight committee to monitor and oversee the individual's activities. Take a look at some country examples of conflict of interest prevention and management strategies. Bangladesh's public procurement rules prohibit the offer of gifts, hospitality, honors, offers of foreign travel or reward, and encouragement to engage in trade, employment, or other transactions, to those involved in the procurement process. The Philippines' conflict of interest policy requires individuals involved in any medicines-related decision-making or policy formulation entity, such as the Drugs and Therapeutics Committee, to declare all conflicts of interest arising from relationships with pharmaceutical companies. The Department of Health's management options may include assigning staff to non-conflicting duties, excluding them from the policy development or evaluation process, or requiring them to sever their relationships. Finally, in Step 10 we will look at monitoring, enforcing, and providing oversight of conflict of interest prevention and management actions. Once the appropriate strategies have been identified for preventing or managing the conflict of interest, the next step is to monitor compliance with the management plan, and decide on, and implement, actions for non-compliance. It is important to regularly monitor and review management plans. Ensure that planned actions have been taken. Adjust plans as needed to account for changes to or resolution of conflicts of interest. Adjust plans if they prove to be unworkable. Consider additional actions as needed. If it is determined that conflict of interest policies and procedures have not been properly adhered to, A range of measures can be taken depending on if the individual is a public employee or an individual providing a service to the government. Measures can be corrective or punitive and include training or counseling, negative employment evaluations or restrictions on promotions, disciplinary action, removal from public employment, monetary fines or penalties, or restrictions on future engagement. Please take a look at it one more time and consider a 10-step process for improving the prevention and management of conflicts of interest. We delved into the intricate details of this vital aspect, examining its significance in various domains. As we ventured deeper into this module, we recognized the crucial role played by well-defined policies, implementation mechanisms, streamlined procedures, and processes in achieving optimal outcomes in diverse scenarios. As we conclude Module 4, we extend our gratitude for your undivided attention. Thank you.